All right, hello everybody. My name is Lisa Sawsville. I'm the Executive Director of Vermont Coverts, and I want to welcome you on behalf of WOW Vermont to our invader discussion. WOW is a partnership with Coverts. See if I can get everybody. Vermont Woodlands Association, Vermont Land Trust, UVM Extension, Fish and Wildlife, Forest Parks and Recreation to empower and educate women landowners to feel strong about managing their woodlands, asking questions, and all those kinds of things. Our programming is women focused, not women only. So welcome to anybody else that is on the call as well. Thank you for joining us to learn about the invaders in our forests. The way the program is going to run tonight is we're going to have a presentation from County Forester Nancy Patch. Nancy's going to tell us a little bit about why invasives is something we need to care about, and then we're going to kind of delve into two specific species. We're then going to break out into breakout rooms where you'll have a facilitator, and the power of WOW is really the sharing of experiences, learning from each other. You know, what are your concerns? What have you done? So in those groups, we're going to ask if you're comfortable with it to turn on your camera and join the conversation. We'll spend about 20-25 minutes in those rooms, and then we'll come back together for any last minute thoughts from the presenters or people in the rooms. And we also would like to see this continue, this sort of learning circle, learning opportunity. We're talking about doing it again in May and focusing on two other species. So we would like feedback from you on which species you might like to hear about and learn about and discuss. So with that, as I mentioned, with the housekeeping, just mute yourselves while we're doing the presentation. When we get into the breakout rooms, if you're comfortable, turn your camera on and unmute yourself and join the conversation, and then we'll come back together. So Nancy, I'm going to turn it over to you, and please tell us about these invaders.
Okay, just bringing up my screen here. All right, hi everyone. So this is a presentation I hope I can get through in a record time. There's a lot of information here, but we will be in that breakout room shortly after this so that we can discuss some of the questions that go on. So I'm probably not going to take any questions during the presentation, but please make note so that we can talk about it in our breakout rooms. I do want to thank the Nature Conservancy of Vermont and Elizabeth Spinney for providing some of the information that's in this presentation as we through it. You know, what we're going to talk about here today is what are non-native invasive species and why do we care about them? You know, what is it? Is it invasive or not? We look at things like hay-scented fern. Normally when I'm in a group where I can look at people, I ask them, everybody raise their hand if they call hay-scented fern an invasive plant. Wild apple trees, are they invasive? And then barberry. So I can quickly want to state that we're kind of moved into this world now where when we want to call something invasive, it's really a non-native invasive plant. So hay-scented fern is a native plant. While it may feel like it's an invasive plant, it plays a role in the ecosystem, and we really would not consider it invasive. You may get mixed messages about that, but in the way that I look at this, if it's a native plant, it's not going to be an invasive plant. Wild apple trees are not invasive. They do not take over places, but a wild apple tree is not a native plant. So that gets confusing. But then we have something like barberry, which is a non-native plant and it's highly invasive. And what does invasive actually mean? What makes that good plant go bad? You know, there's lots of things. One of the most important probably is the fact that there is a lack of native predators. So basically nothing eats them. And they've been popular. These plants are very popular because of that very fact. So horticultural plants that are around your yard, if you're not going to have an insect problem, they're going to look more beautiful. They also have a very abundant seed production. or they can spread through rhizomes. So there's an ability to revegetate at a very quick rate. They're highly competitive. They grow quickly and they spread. They have very effective ways to disperse those seeds. So wildlife that is feeding on them, or a wind distribution, that gets them across the landscape. They also are very efficient at competing with our native plants for light and nutrients. Many of these plants are considered C4 plants, which means that they utilize carbon out of the air, out of the environment, more efficiently than many of our native plants. So with our warming climate, with the increasing amount of carbon in our atmosphere, they are having a competitive edge. That may be one reason, and it's all theory, why they're spreading so. They also utilize nutrients more effectively and can change the soil chemistry themselves, which will discourage other native plants and encourage the competition edge that they have. One of the things you want to think about here is that in Vermont, these numbers look pretty specific, so they probably are right around these numbers, but there are a lot of non-native plants in Vermont. 32% of our plant biology is considered non-native, but only 8% are invasive plants. So we've planted a lot of things here in our gardens, and but most of them have not jumped past our gardens. So why do we care again? This is a really big part, why are we concerned about this? On a global basis, the two biggest destroyers of biodiversity are habitat destruction, and then second behind that is the invasion of exotic species. So this is why we really care. They're very impactful on the landscape. They push out native species. They are generally a very poor food source for wildlife. We'll talk about two of those plants later today and why they are particularly bad for wildlife. They do degrade habitats for other things. Like I mentioned before, they can change the soil chemistry, where if these plants come into a stand of sugar maple, for example, with a very rich soil, they can start acidifying that soil, which makes it harder for our native plants to grow. How they got here, where did they come from? We've introduced these plants. We've introduced them for all kinds of reasons, but primarily we've been introducing them because of landscape horticulture. And that's actually reflected on our landscape sometimes when you can think about where wealth was concentrated and homes in those areas, those homes would like to have specimen plants. So they brought all kinds of things in. And many of these plants were brought in, 100 years ago, some more recently. But those areas where people had the ability to bring in something new, establish these plants at an early time. And that could be one reason why we don't see them in the higher elevations as much, because those were poor hill farms and people weren't planting exotic plants in those areas. I have a book in my office that shows all these plants that we use for erosion control. And there were a whole bunch of, this was from about 40 years ago, and a whole bunch of those plants were now invasive species. And so we, foresters, wildlife biologists, professionals were suggesting that we plant some of these things out there for erosion control, and it turned out that they escaped and became real problems. So there's lots of reasons they're here. Some of them are a mistake. Others, there was no intention of bad practice. It's what happened. This slide is actually almost the most important slide in the whole presentation, I think. This is really about where plants are on the landscape, what you can do about them, when you can have your most effect. When an invasive plant becomes established in the environment, in your woods, that's the very best time to get rid of them. Even before they come in, the best thing to be doing on in your woodlot is to be monitoring for these plants, looking for the plants, learn what they are and go out and monitor your woodlot and look for them. And if you find an invasive plant, get rid of it. That's when the early detection takes place, and that's when eradication is the easiest. So this is so important to start paying attention, know where these plants are located, and even down the road, if you see these plants somewhere else that are nearby, they can move quite quickly. So looking at early detection when eradication, because we would really love to have them completely be gone from an area. So I'd love to eradicate. When you start seeing them, when people start noticing them, you're already getting to the point where eradication is getting harder. So you're still in it, and you can see this curve that's here that shows this is an exponential curve. We're early down here, we can get rid of these plants, and all of a sudden we start seeing them before very long, they're out of control. And so when we get to a point where public awareness typically begins, they're almost out of control, and eradication can no longer be thought of without a great deal of effort. So then we get into where there's a lot of plants. We're going to be talking about control and management, and maybe not eradication. And it gets more expensive the whole time those plants are gaining ground. So again, this is just a really important concept to keep in mind about when you can get rid of plants easiest. And working with your neighbors is also, it's very helpful for everyone to be aware of this. Now, we are going to talk about, getting a plant management, invasive plant management plan in place. I want to stress over and over here that the very best resource you might want to have where you can go to is the VTInvasives.org site. That is an incredible resource for anyone to find out about whatever invasive plant is available or is present in Vermont and what you can do about it. So this is a place that you can actually go into, develop your plan, and find out what you can do. I will be going back to this over and over again. It really has been an incredibly well-developed website. There's all kinds of things, not only plant invasives, but also insect invasives as well. In that plan that you're going to be developing, as I mentioned, eradication is the ideal, but if eradication it's past that, you want to start looking at where these plants are located. And the very best plan is to move from the outside edge of the dense infestation and push it back. So, for example, you might find invasive plants all along the edge of a field because of the light conditions there are better for the plants. The birds that are eating the seed are probably edge birds, so they're going to be dropping the seed in this open area. So walk the edge of your forest, and if you see plants moving into the woodlot, you should work them back out. So work from the outside in. That's the highest priority because it's the lowest density of the infestation. So you have a chance to get a handle on it. You can eliminate those little isolated pockets and prevent the further reproduction and further spread of this. And it's easier to monitor. So, keep looking at where you're going and where you've removed plants. You might want to even hang some flagging where the very edge of the plants were, and so that that you're not going past that point. So there's some just keeping that idea of outside bringing into that core of the infestation. So to get started on a plan, again, assess it, walk out in the forest, identify where things are. What kind of treatment are you open to or willing to implement on the property? Think about those methodologies and start working on it. We're going to talk about some of that in a bit, but every year should be a monitoring adventure, really. Maybe you could go out, teach your grandchildren or your children what some of these plants look like. I know one time I was showing some sugar makers these invasive plants, and the guys didn't know what they were. And then I started showing what they look like and identifying. And the next time I ran into one of them, they said, I am seeing this plant everywhere and I'm just pulling it out of the ground. So now if you know what it looks like, you can do something about it. So we are going to talk about two plants tonight. And the first one we're going to talk about is common buckthorn. It's very prevalent throughout the state. This is probably one of the top three of the invasive plants in terms of numbers across the state. It really does take over areas. We have two kinds of buckthorn, common buckthorn and glossy buckthorn. These plants were brought in a long, long time ago. I think perhaps even 100 years ago, and they were utilized often for hedges. If you prune them or hedge them like a cedar hedge, they will get very, very dense and really create a wall that would limit movement of even animals, domestic animals, or keep a privacy hedge. So they've been very, very popular for that privacy screen. But what they've done is escape. They're one of the 8% that's escaped and become a bad plant. They really push out native shrubs. So they have a competitive edge. They have a very bad nesting structure for songbirds. They can change the soil nitrogen levels and change the soil insects, whether you're affecting the biota in the soil. If the buckthorn is in a sugar bush, they can limit the amount of magnesium and calcium that's going to then be available to the sugar maple tree, limiting its growth. The berry that they produce is and the common buckthorn is a blackberry, and it has a chemical diuretic in it. So if birds flock to these berries and they gorge on them, they will not gain any nutrition out of those berries because it's a diuretic and it will go straight through their system and they spread it around. So it's not helping them. This is a real evolutionary advantage for this plant. The berry is eaten in abundance and goes straight through the digestive systems. The best way to look at common buckthorn, at least, it seems these twigs, the end of the twigs typically fork. This one's not showing that classic fork, but in between the fork, there is a fake thorn. So that fake thorn is really a modified branch, but it looks like a thorn. So wherever there's a fork in the twig, you should find one of those modified branches that looks like a thorn. That's the very best way to identify this in the field, in addition to that dark blackberry. There are lots of ways to kind of manage this plant. If they're little, you can pull them up with your hand. I do that quite a lot when I'm walking through the woods. If I see a small buckthorn, I'll pull it out of the ground, getting as much of the root system as I can and hanging it upside down in a tree. That's one of the things you want to really think about, is that any of these invasive plants, if you pick them up and throw them on the ground, they will probably or very likely could reroot. And so you really want to hang them up, get all those roots up into the air so they can dry out. Pulling a plant generally does not remove all of the roots. That's why monitoring is so very important, that if there's any little root left, in a couple of years, you may see a plant coming back in that very location where you had pulled those roots. But if you keep doing it, you're going to diminish the amount of resource that those roots have. Larger plants, you can remove a larger plant with that weed wrench. You can see the weed wrench down below here. It's really just, the mechanism is a lever, and it really does work. Look how large this plant is. This plant is 14 feet tall probably, and that weed wrench, you can get right in there and pull that out of there. You don't have to be a powerful, strong person to do it either. You just use the power of your own body to pull that out of the ground. So weed wrenching works. You can also girdle the stem close to the ground a couple of times. So that's basically what you're doing, is stopping the flow of nutrients to the crown. These, and just keep cutting it. I know people that will go out and repeat cut these plants. You could do it once you cut it down, you could go back with a brush saw and you can cut the smaller stems. The thing that you need to remember though about buckthorn is that it is it's a survivor, and it's kind of, if you cut it, it'll resprout. It resprouts at the roots and it resprouts at the stump. That's why it's sometimes good to cut it high first and then go back and cut it low again. I'm not sure where I'm in. I think I've got some slides here about herbicide treatment too, but let's talk about it in a couple of places. So if you cut this tree high in the springtime, this is a lot of labor, but if you can cut it high in the spring, you come back in the fall and cut it low and apply an herbicide to the stump. That's called a cut stump treatment. And that would be very successful on a plant of this size. Looking at buckthorn management, there are a lot of ways to approach this. And I know that some people are very opposed to using herbicides. And in some cases, it doesn't make a lot of sense. If the plant, it could be too much to tackle to be putting herbicide throughout the environment. So if you look at this kind of handy dandy calendar here, you can pull any time of the year. January, February, and December aren't noted here because typically we would be in snow cover with frozen ground conditions. So hand pulling and digging doesn't make sense then. But whenever the ground is not frozen, you can hand pull and dig these plants out of the ground. I actually will, if they're a big plant and they're accessible, a tractor or a four-wheeler with a chain, you wrap that chain around that plant and pull it out of the ground. You can continually, the same time of the year during the growing season, you can cut and mow it. If it's in the woods, it's harder to do, but if it's spreading into a field, or if you want to get it on the edge of the field, you can cut and mow. And girdling, as I mentioned in the previous slide, where you're cutting around the stem and stopping those nutrient flows, you can do that any time of the year. There are two ways to girdle. We have mechanical girdling and we have chemical girdling. So there are two types of girdle, and like that's mentioned down below. And you can do that at any time of the year. So girdling or basal bark treatment, or girdling and frilling, which is an herbicide control, that can be done any time of the year. There's also a non-herbicide way to that's very, very effective, is to use a flamethrower. I know that there's some companies out there that are helping to manage invasive plants that do that they use a direct flame or prescribed burn. You need to do that at the time of year when you're not going to have any kind of fire hazard where the fire could spread. So the very best time is when The snow has diminished to some extent, but it's still there. The soil conditions are wet. So direct flame works. Foliar herbicide works as well. If you have a small plant, it's easy to use a backpack sprayer. Sometimes what happens is we'll go in and cut it. So you cut some big plants down, they resprout the next year, so they're low to the ground, and you can go in and you can foliar spray those plants during the growing season. The other herbicide treatment that again is very effective, and that's the cut surface herbicide, which I've explained before, where you cut the stump. That has to actually, that's the area, the time of year that's the most constricted. And that's because at this time of year, August, September, early October, that's when the plant is bringing all of its nutrients down into its root system. So if you apply an herbicide to that stump is going to suck that herbicide up and send it down into the roots. And so those roots will then, the whole plant will die. It is a very effective, very targeted approach to herbicide control. So there's a lot of ways, and I'll talk about this with the other plant we're going to talk about later on, but there's a lot of ways to affect and manage. The next plant that I'd like to talk about is honeysuckle. So honeysuckle is, again, one of the top three. So I kind of think of buckthorn, honeysuckle, and barberry as being the three plants that we have the most of throughout Vermont. It also really crowds native shrubs out. It's a very bad nesting structure for songbirds. The leaves of the honeysuckle really only exist on the outside edge of the plant. So it looks like you can't see through it. And a bird will come in and put their nest and lay their eggs up inside here with these really kind of nice forked branches. It seems like a perfect place for a bird, but the predators come in underneath and they can just easily see that nest. And so egg predation is dramatic in a honeysuckle plant. It's just a terrible place for songbirds to nest. The berries as well they do have some nutrition, but the problem with the berries is they're nowhere near the nutrition of our native berries. And this plant can displace our native berries to the extent where there's very little food of high quality left for the songbirds before they are ready to fly south for the winter. So it can be a real problem. And they again gorge on these fruits and spread them all around. They are the first plants. The thing about honeysuckle, they're the first plants to leaf out in the spring, or one of the first. We do have native plants that also leaf out early, like chokecherry, but you can really see those honeysuckles in the woods at this time of year, right? This time of year, and in the next week or two, you go out in the forest and you can really see these plants, and they become quite full very early. So they prevent light from reaching the forest floor as well, but they are easy to see at this time of year. Okay, these are the honeysuckles that we have a problem with, bush honeysuckles. These are Asian or European honeysuckles. One of the things I wanted to note here is that they do have a hollow pith. That's really important because I'm going to show you this next slide, which are our native plants. We have Deervilla lanicera, which is a bush honeysuckle, and we have Lanicera canadensis, which is fly honeysuckle. We don't want to pull these plants out. They're native. They're not very common. Once you get used to seeing them, you really can identify them quite easily. The bush honeysuckle has a really different kind of flower and fruit. The flower is elongated more than the European flowers are. and they will turn into these cymes with this very, very different fruit. It's a husk, not a berry. And so this one is not really reminiscent of the exotics as much. One of the ones that gets me confused, and sometimes I'm not really sure, but this is a broader leaved plant. There's some really kind of interesting drooping to the leaves, and the berries and the flowers are really just at the very edge, at the very terminal point of the branch. So you see these double flowers. Those double flowers are happening right at the end of the branch, as does the berry. So this is one where it doesn't really look like the other honeysuckle, except the branch pattern does and the bark does. So it's still very confusing, but looking for just those terminal berries and flowers. And for both of these species, if you cut the stem is not hollow. And that's the biggest thing that can help you. This is what bush honeysuckle looks like in the woods. It can just simply take over the forest. This stand right here of maple, once those trees are gone, there will be no forest here unless something is done. It is a honeysuckle patch beneath the overstory. So small plants, you pick them up. Large plants, repeat cut. Try doing some stump treatments if you're willing to use herbicides. And with honeysuckle, it's very similar to the buckthorn when you can treat it. Looking again at that cut surface herbicide in August and September. So as a summary of what we can do to get rid of these plants, hand pulling, and believe me, I probably do that more than anything else. Mechanical removal, personally, I use that tractor and a chain and wrap around. There's flame control really works, animal control and herbicide control. This is what we're doing. Get your family out and get rid of that patch of in this case, it looks like garlic mustard. Get a weed wrench, pull some things out. There's also companies that can do things on a bigger scale. So you can really chop the understory up and get it to start over. These flame, as I'm explaining, do it where there's some snow. It really works. There are other means, goats, there's actually roving goats out there. There are people that have herds of goats that they bring to different places to fight back against invasive plants. In this case, multiflora rose is being targeted by goats. We've got the basal bark application of herbicide, cut stump, backpack sprayer, and a mist blower if you hire someone where it can really affect some large plants. Again, I'm going back to your resources. The Nature Conservancy has a wonderful booklet out there, and you can find that on VTInvasives. And on VTInvasives, there's also a list, all kinds of lists of resources. This is, I think we're going to probably be able to share this out with this list of links and resources later on as a follow-up. So prevention, early detection, work from the edges inward, try not to disturb the soil, and focus on what you want to do. The all-out war can be overwhelming, and just do it a little at a time if that's what you can do. Focus your efforts. We're going to now stop the presentation and go into our breakout rooms. So thanks for putting up with me here.